So this week, I think we're going to jump into the topic of centrism, kind of focusing around Andrew Yang and his recent, I don't know, just the weird messaging that he's been doing around his new Forward Party thing.
Yeah.
As you know, I mean, I interviewed Andrew Yang way back in the day. I was one of the original interviews.
That's so nuts, man.
Yeah, it was kind of cool. He was like, he'd been on Sam Harris's podcast, and he was kind of like a known name a little bit in Silicon Valley. But I had a friend who like had a connection with him, and was like, hey, do you want to interview Andrew? And I was like, sure,
Can I ask you first, what was your initial? Because did you know about him before you interviewed him? Had you done any research on him, or was it pretty like cold interview?
Back then, I listened to every episode Sam Harris released. So yeah, I heard him on Sam Harris's podcast.
What was your initial impression of the man? Not the policies and like the things he wanted to do, but what was your general felt sense of the guy himself?
He really did seem very authentic. He just friendly. I mean, I was approaching him as a journalist, so of course, like I'm gonna get a kind of a rosy view of the guy. But we talked off, quote unquote, off camera. It wasn't like it wasn't a video thing. It was for a we talked on Skype, but it was just for a written piece. But like even when he knew that I wasn't recording, I wasn't taking notes. He was like fun to talk to. We talked about some shit that we talked about like Zoltan Istvan, the transhumanist guy. We talked about kind of goofy things like that. Which would have been fun to put in the interview, but genuinely really liked him. I also met him just a couple months ago in San Francisco at like an event for his his book release.
Really
great guy. Like I everything about him I really like, which is, I mean, partly why I kind of want to discuss him. In that, like, I think his messaging has just been like terrible recently. It's been I like the guy. I mean, it's not a comment on the guy. It's just like his movement and the potential in general for third party stuff, for centrism stuff, for let's tone down the narrative of left and right stuff. All of it. If there was anyone who could conceivably get that messaging right, it seemed to me that it could be Andrew Yang.
Right.
And I think that he's doing it so wrong. So I mean, I'm kind of curious. Have you followed any of his recent communications, like the CNN interview or anything like that?
Yeah, I checked out the CNN interview. It was interesting because I didn't think it went as badly as people thought it did. I mean, I think it's interesting how it was marketed, because I saw a lot of headlines about it when it happened, and then I watched at least a segment, like a 5 to 10 minute segment of the interview. I'm not sure exactly how long the long form was, but it was, all the headlines were like, a catastrophe for Andrew Yang, like, a fall from grace, and I watched the interview, and I thought the way that the questioning was going wasn't particularly insightful, and it was obviously like a hot seat interview where he was interviewing somebody that was aggressively, maybe not against what he was doing, but was doing that kind of like network television thing where he was being not charitable, to be diplomatic, but like, just doing that thing where it's like, well, what is it then? Well, what is it?
Right.
Well, what is it that you said for that? And it's just like, hey, man, like, we're all used to listening to podcasts now. You know what I mean? Like, we're all used to an interview format that's like a little bit more, I don't know, expository, like a little bit more like, oh, well, if you're not feeling like you can take a stand on this, then like, well, what's going on with that?
Right.
And
breathing room, and yeah,
it seemed like they really had an agenda to pin him to the wall, that he didn't have specific talking points. Now, that being said, he didn't have any fucking specific talking points, which obviously bothered me a little bit.
Well, he kept repeating the same thing, which seemed like a calculated thing that someone had almost written for him of repeat this, and it just didn't land correctly. It landed terribly. And after that happened, I texted a friend of mine. Well, I mean, maybe just to give a literal like background to anyone who might be listening and for some reason isn't aware of the thing.
Yeah.
Andrew Yang has a thing called the Forward Party, and like what makes sense about it is that he wants to take a couple of high level ideas about changing the system of our politics rather than just like tweaking the edges of some policies. He wants to change the system kind of fundamentally, with basically three different things. One is to promote ranked choice voting. The second is to have nonpartisan primaries, and the third is for independent redistricting commissions. All
That's
good
very
ideas.
specific.
Yeah, those are really good ideas, right? And his idea is to bring both Republicans and Democrats and independents, kind of bring everyone on board with the idea that you can have individual policy issues. You can be pro or against abortion. You can be, for more immigration or not. But you have to want ranked choice voting, nonpartisan primaries, and independent redistricting. Those things are non-negotiable. This is kind of what I understand. And so it's not about specific policies. That, I think, he simply did not articulate very well on the CNN interview or like on Twitter or any other platform where he's kind of doing messaging to the masses, And so I've spoken to some kind of insiders, some people who used to work for his campaign, and they get this messaging and they can repeat, kind of by heart what I just said. How it kind of isn't about the issues, and there's a way that makes sense, For some reason, I'm just kind of disappointed in like the way he's turning off so many people, because this is kind of what I'm seeing by not presenting that message. I'm seeing that he's attracting a lot of Republicans onto the Forward Party, and a lot of people who don't necessarily care about issues, or maybe the Republicans, I think they sneakily want to, because this is what Republicans so often do. They say, oh yeah, we're for everybody, we're not contentious, and then they sneak in their Supreme Court justices that overturn abortion. You know what I mean? Exactly. There's so much about that with the Republican folks, which is brilliant. It's very, very smart, So I think that like a lot of the criticisms are kind of true, that I feel like his new thing is being a little naive about it at best case scenario, it's going to be a little bit of a third party spoiler. It's also just probably not going to go anywhere. I don't know. But what is your take on all that?
I didn't know that was the three pillars of his movement, and those all make kind of irrefutable sense. Like, you can't. Those three things are things that are broken about the system that should absolutely change. The weird thing to me was that in the interview, maybe he's been in the political landscape for so long, you can't imagine he hasn't had a hostile interview. The thing that I was kind of remarking on was it seemed like he was hedging back to a playbook that is a lot more oriented around just the typical type of political speak that we see in this country that is now feeling very archaic, which is, well, we're trying to do this, and we're trying to do this, and we're trying to do this, and we're trying, and there's this way of kind of like moving the chicken coop around the yard enough times that it never really touches something. And I wonder if, I was craving him, because he was saying, the thing that he kept saying was, well, we're trying to bring people together for common sense policy.
Right.
Like when it comes to a policy, we're trying to get the general common sense consensus. And I think what I was like lusting for was him to be like data backed, or say something like that. But that you can't say that, because there's so many people in this country right now where you say something like science backed or something like data backed, and it puts you in a place. And so I feel in a political kind of spectrum, and I was wondering, I'm like, oh, does he have a list of things that he can't say because it feels like that statement itself feels too Republican, or it feels too liberal? You know what I mean? Like it was very obfuscated.
Yeah, back in the day when he was on the Democratic ticket, he was so much more honest seeming, because he would name policies and he would say, people want this. Like look at the polling data. Everyone wants marijuana to be legalized. Not
Right.
everyone, but like the majority. And so that's an issue. He would name the thing, and like down the line, he was like Mr. Policy, Mr. Data backed. And this is the
Data is a
thing
dirty
that I
word now.
yeah, it kind of is, but this is the thing that's just kind of disappointing about centrism in general, to maybe pivot into just like that conversation a little bit. Part of what's frustrating about centrism is that it's positioned as this like the rational alternative to the left and right, and it's a compromise and it's between the two, right? But
Right.
if you look at what people want, and if you look at what would actually make people happy, by like looking at other societies and what makes other people happy, it's
Right.
very radical left things. I mean, quote unquote radical. It
Sure.
is better healthcare, like free single payer healthcare. It is doing something about the drug wars, just not having
Right.
having people go to jail for
Not
marijuana
having them.
offenses. There's there really are things that people actually do agree on, but they're not centrist. They're leftist policies. They really, really, truly are. And I think that to say that you're a centrist and position yourself as like outside, having biases or anything like that, it's
Right.
it's like a fantasy, because a policy can be radically right or radically left, and that's
Yeah.
by the data and by what people want, that's what it is. But to say you're always between the two things, that means you haven't really actually carefully thought about any issues. And it also, one more note about this, is that I feel like it can very often have a false dichotomy about things that are reasonable or not. I mean, let's say we're talking about climate change. Are you gonna have talk to somebody who's says climate change is human caused and blah 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 blah, and that's like your leftist position, and your right position is there's no such thing as climate change, it's a hoax,
Right.
it's not human caused. You're setting up a false dichotomy. One of those is like in the real world and rational. The other is nonsense. Or what if there's the right voice says that we shouldn't have a minimum wage, and if you're 10 years old, you should be able to hold a job and work 50 hours a week. Why not free market?
Right.
That's not a position that anyone should take seriously. And if that were to be the case, to position that against a leftist view, and let's meet in the middle where you have very minimum wage and you can work when you're 14 or something, like that's absurd. So I have a lot of problems with centrism in general, even though I'm kind of drawn to it because I grew up Republican and now I'm on the left. I don't even really want to say I'm a Democrat because I think that the Democratic Party is so beholden to big corporate interests, yada yada yada. It's this stuff
Right.
is
Well, I wonder if part of what people mean when they say centrist is that, because I would be tempted to call myself a centrist because I kind of pick
right.
and choose policies from either side that feel rooted in reality to me. Like I'm in Montana right now. People have guns out here. People open carry out here in a certain way. And I guess this is arguable, especially from folks in cities. But, folks in cities would say, oh, well, there's no reason to have guns. You just don't need them. And in the country, I don't know that that's 100% true because, law enforcement sometimes is an hour and a half away, or you've got wild animals, you've got coyotes, you've got bears, you've got all kinds of things that can threaten your life, not to mention people that can threaten your life, which is just as prevalent in the country as it is in the city. And so for me, I think, oh, well, yeah, no, I think guns are legit. I think that, I personally am a gun owner. I support people's right to carry firearms. That gets into I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. But then, there's other things out here that I just can't agree with. And so when someone says centrism, I wonder if what they mean is I'm picking and choosing things from the left and the right. Because is there really a center of a lot of these policies? They're policies. They're discrete by nature. It's this way or it's that way. We have a legal system that makes laws, and most laws, for good reason, don't have a gray area. Unless we're talking about fucking tax laws. But for the most part, people have to pick and choose the issues that they're interested in having set in stone and a part of our legal code. So do you think that's maybe something that maybe centrism is reaching for, is kind of where I find myself, where I'm picking and choosing things based on, what I see and where I'm at? or is it really people that are trying to make some kind of, I mean, look, man, there's an old story about a king named Solomon, all right? And there's one baby, and you can either split it in half and kill it, or you can give it to one person or another. There is no actual splitting of the baby that kills the baby.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, you have to pick a side on issues. I don't know if you tally that up and then eventually that makes you a Republican or eventually that makes you a Democrat. That does seem kind of stupid to me. There should be something that people are able to identify with where there's a broader perspective, and they say, well, I mean, some of this stuff, you know, like, I can't get on board with banning abortion, but I can totally get on board with owning guns. You know, does that make sense? What, I don't even know. Maybe what's going on here?
Yeah, in my mind, you know, I'm not exactly sure how like a political scientist would parse this, but in my mind, that's describing an independent. Sure. Which is, I think, different from centrism. There's this kind of pejorative called the enlightened centrist. People make fun of the enlightened centrist, and these are kind of more the people I think that I'm talking about, where they're above the fray. There's partisan politics, but I'm above that. I'm not biased like those people who watch CNN or those people who watch Fox News. I'm above that. Right. That, I think, is just, you're really probably not digging into issues. You probably don't know the issues very well. And two, you're kind of just like full of shit if you really think you're not a biased person. That's kind of insane.
You've got artisanal echo chambers.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I want to throw another, like, just, I don't know, data point or something in here, which is that I think that part of the problem is that people on the right who are sympathetic to the Republican Party, they're so into jumping on board with anything that's not policy related, but that's just culture war talking points. Whereas on the left, there's tons of culture war talking points, but it divides people. It doesn't bring them together. So we can be brought together on things like healthcare. We can't be brought together on things like Black Lives Matter or anything that's maybe that's not even the best example, because that did bring people together quite a bit. But there's a lot of woke stuff. Gender politics, and just in general woke stuff that totally divides the left, completely divides the left. Where a lot of people on the left side say, oh, if you don't fully support this particular gender ideology of the moment, then you're really a Republican. You know what I mean? There's so much of that type of thing.
Right.
And I think that there's something that also just the Democrats themselves as a political party need to figure that out and need to figure out how to message that, because it does give fuel to nonsensical-ish third-party platforms if they're scaring people away by being by just always knee-jerk signaling to the wokest of the woke far left radical mob, who literally is just like 20-year-olds in college, because that's where a lot of that just lives, and we're all kind of radical in our early 20s. And I think that the Democrats should just be more normie. They really should. I don't think they're expected to be normie. So don't say mother, don't say pregnant person, that sort of thing. Very basic things, basic.
Well, I think it's interesting. Something that I noticed switching from California to Montana is that there's a particular evil that's kind of endemic to both sides. And I think on the left, one of the really difficult things is you've got a very educated, college educated, I use the word education in a kind of formatted way, where I'm talking about higher education and people who believe themselves to be aware of what's going on in all places, because they consume, they've read a lot of books and they've gone to college, and they've seen, they like to think that they expose themselves to different types of media, and that creates an echo chamber of its own, where it's really hard to disabuse people of the idea that they know what's going on, kind of pan America. But then it's the same kind of tapeworm on the right, where you've got folks that are maybe not as educated, like in the kind of higher education sense, smart, no doubt about it, right? but that are also being marketed this idea that they understand what's going on in in a countrywide way. And what I find switching back and forth between the two places is that even some of the people who, when I'm in California, I would consider to be very perspective, have zero relationship to what it is like to live in a rural state, in a rural place, and to deal with rural issues. And the same is true for the right. Like you see this, the huge backlash against Black Lives Matter. I'm like, there were so many people, here in Montana that were up in arms. There's 2 Black people in this town. 2.
Right.
And I'm not being,
yeah.
I'm not like exaggerating. You know what I mean?
Wow. Yeah.
And they have just zero relationality. And I wonder if one of the things that's causing people to split apart so much and causing other people to maybe try to gravitate towards something that's more reasonable is that people are being marketed this idea that they know what's going on. And it's amazing to me. I mean, I remember the first time I came out to Montana, it was during the Trump presidency, and I was kind of shocked because Trump was portrayed in such a positive light out here, where he was so demonized in California. But then it's like you come out here and you realize like, well, any president, no matter how far one way or the other they lean, does good things for certain people. And you just don't hear that in California. And then it creates this facsimile of a person that you're able to, it creates this straw man that you're able to just completely destroy in your mind. It doesn't create a person that you can hate holistically. You know what I mean? And out here, it was, obviously the echo chamber of Trump and his presidency, and people were so enamored with the things that maybe he did do. There was no awareness of the criminality and the kind of, the things that you're being marketed in California. There was none of it. None of that messaging was out here. And so it makes sense to me that certain people are experiencing this emotional fatigue, and maybe they don't know how to name it, or maybe they don't know, you obviously got someone like Andrew Yang kind of seeing it in the culture and so, I can see that people are being marketed this totally different set of facts. And it's not just that people here, in Republican country are living in a world where they're only hearing lies. No, they're hearing facts, but they're just hearing facts that slant towards where they want to hear those facts. And on the other side, it's the same. And I don't know what the answer is to that, because it really boils down to a news media situation where you've got this very intelligent psychological marketing happening that is targeting certain groups. Now, the thing I will mention before I close my soapbox rant on the divide is that the left does need to have a more solid idea of what they are and what they want, and to be stable in that. And that's something that Republicans have as a tenet of their kind of core nature. Again, small towns, you congregate around being socially connected to the people that you care about. Maybe you put a couple of the beliefs that you really believe into the side so that you don't get in an argument with your neighbor, because that guy is actually more important to you than a political system. And there's a rally mentality, and people can gather themselves around ideas that maybe they're not 100% on, but everybody else is. So it's more important to be a part of the group. And then you've got people on the left where it's just a total scattershot diversion, dispersion of ideas that people are trying to hold on to. And as soon as there's, like you said, as soon as somebody comes into the conversation saying, I want to be seen, people are like, oh, well, we're the party of being seen. And it's like, yeah, but there's all kinds of wacky people out there. There's a lot of people that want to be seen for reasonable stuff, and there's people that take that to an extreme, and it's a shame that it separates on that line.
Well, let me ask you a quick question that's relevant to that. In my mind, the left, the Democrats, have a ton of problems, but they're not as kind of fundamental. In my mind, I'm asking this because I live in the urban area, and I don't see the other side of it necessarily. Is the right as broken as it seems in terms of there's the Trumpist right and then there's the Liz Cheney types who are,
Yeah,
or the,
yeah.
the David Frum types who are like Republican, but they're rhinos, Republican in name, as Trump calls them. Is that a real thing? Do you sense a lot of animosity between those two types of right folks, or is that partly made up by the media?
No, it's there. It's definitely
Hmm.
there. I wouldn't say there's an animosity because, again, I think that when people are in a small place, they need to gather around a common set of shared ideas, and that's a little bit more important to this. The social fabric is more important than the political fabric.
What does a Trumpist think of Liz Cheney? Do you have any read on that? I have no read.
Oh, dude, Trumpism is a guttural, visceral experience, right? Like
Right.
it's folks who need daddy. You know, they need
Yeah.
daddy to tell them what's going on, and they don't feel particularly compelled to parse out the issues for themselves. Which, on one hand, it's a lot harder to do that than it's ever been. You have to sift through a lot of stuff to find the truth. And a lot of people just aren't equipped for that. They're equipped for an era where there was three fucking TV stations,
Hmm.
and they're used to being spoon-fed a narrative, and they like that. And it again, the political fabric being separate from the social fabric, it's easier, I think, for people to compartmentalize that stuff out here and say, whatever daddy says, he's daddy, and I think, it goes with the social fabric in a certain way too, because I see that all the time. I mean, not just here, that happens at home too, but, where there's I'm the father and I'm the leader, and I tell you what's good and what's bad, and you listen. And it's an authoritarian, sensibility.
Hmm.
And there is a lot of animosity, but I don't think it's particularly directed at anyone other than who it's told to be directed. It's not self-directed animosity. They're not like, looking into Liz Cheney's politics or anything like that. They're reading headlines, they're
Hmm.
reading shared Facebook articles, and they're allowing themselves to be emotionally activated by it. You
Wow,
know,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we can wrap that up for the Andrew Yang centrism politics
Okay.
talk, and
Yeah.
uh, we'll come back to maybe some more cultural, psychological, philosophical things next week. But great
Nice.
talk, Stefan. I think that was really interesting, and I do enjoy always hearing that perspective from the rural American out there in Montana. It's always fascinating.
Out here, I'm Tom Papa in America. Yeah, let me just add
The
my
real
closing note.
America, the real
The
America,
real
of
the
course.
real America. Let me just add my closing note, which is
Yeah.
this. If you are a person that fancies yourself very aware of what's going on in the country, you need to go somewhere else.
Oh,
Because
totally agree. Absolutely.
you need to go visit somewhere else, or if you can, embed yourself in somewhere that's radically different from where you are. You are not, and this is coming from a person that lived in California most of my life and considers I'm an educated person, right? I like read a lot of books, blah blah blah. I'm a liberal, and I before I came out here, I thought I had a pretty good perspective on what it was like to live in America, and I didn't. And there's a lot of things that you just can't understand until you switch gears. You have to be able to, and until then, it has to be the same kind of cultural relativist conversation that we have around. This is not a great comparison to draw, but I'm going to draw it anyways. Where we're very much told, rightfully so, that we shouldn't speak on the lives of Black people. We should let Black people speak for themselves, even as much as, like, as an educated white person, you want to believe, the struggle, what it's like. Oh, I've seen the videos, I know I've read a lot about slavery, this and that and this and that, but you just don't know. You can't have a perspective on something that you don't live. And when you live in a place that's very clustered around a certain political ideology, I promise you're getting a lot of propaganda. You're getting a lot of propaganda, and that goes for folks on the right and that goes for folks on the left. And until you can have an experience where you travel through this country and stay with people that think differently than you can't speak on it. You can think about it and you can try to, do the mental gymnastic in your mind of, coming up with an opinion that seems reasonable, but you have to hold yourself back at that fence and say, okay, but this is just what seems reasonable given the information I have. That is the epidemic on both sides. You don't know what's going on the other side. You can listen, and if you can get there and you can go back and forth, you can start to have somewhat of a perspective. But until you do that, you just have to hold yourself to the metaphorical realm, you know, and have the proper amount of respect that your opinions are just opinions. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's the facts.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And I mean, just one anecdote that I'll close out with is it's interesting to me. I remember about this time last year, I was living in San Francisco and I was sitting on a bench in Dolores Park reading a book. Nice day, you know? And this dad and his son sit down next to me, and they had this super, intense Southern accent.
Sure.
And I had never heard that before in San Francisco. And my knee-jerk reaction was like, oh my God, they must like hate this place. They must hate everyone here. And then I just kind of reflected on thought how like funny and naive that even was, because who knows, who like that says nothing about them really. That's like one data point about these people, and it literally means nothing. And I had to just kind of laugh about it and be like, you know what? The whole thing is so silly that I would even assume that. And anyway, it's fascinating. It's just an interesting thing. The biases that are so deeply ingrained in us in these regards. The country versus the south, north, east, west.
Homosexuals around here.
Right.
Man, they're cool as fuck.
Right. Exactly.
There's some cool fucking guys out there.